In 1945, the US Army did something no victor had ever done before. They sat down with the generals they had just defeated, men who had fought them from North Africa to Berlin, and asked them one question. What did we do right? What did we do wrong? And who among our commanders actually scared you? The answers were recorded in a program called the Foreign Military Studies. Hundreds of documents, thousands of pages, sitting in the National Archives in Washington. Most people have never heard of it. What those German generals said about Eisenhower, Patton and Montgomery, some of it was respect, some of it was contempt, and some of it was the kind of brutal honesty that only comes from men who have nothing left to lose. Let's go through it. Picture the German general staff in the final years of World War II. These were not amateurs. Men like Gerd von Rundstedt had been studying war since before most Allied officers were born. Erich von Manstein had executed the most audacious armoured manoeuvre in military history through the Ardennes in 1940. Heinz Guderian had invented the modern theory of armoured warfare. These were soldiers, cold, professional, deeply educated in Clausewitz and Schlieffen, and they watched the Allied commanders across the wire with the same forensic attention a chess grandmaster gives an opponent. After the war, the US Army did something remarkable, and almost nobody talks about it. They didn't just accept the German surrender, they interviewed these generals, systematically, for years, under a program called the Foreign Military Studies Program, run out of Bad Nauheim, Germany, beginning in 1945. Hundreds of after-action reports, thousands of pages. German generals, many of them awaiting trial, some facing execution, sitting down and giving their brutally honest assessments of the men who beat them. The Americans wanted to learn from their enemies. What they got was something far more complicated. But hidden inside these dry military studies is something almost no documentary mentions: the visceral, almost personal fear that one Allied commander inspired in the German High Command. George S. Patton. By the summer of 1944, German intelligence had a simple protocol. Wherever Patton was rumoured to be, that was where the main attack was coming. The Allies actually weaponized this. Operation Fortitude used Patton as a decoy before D-Day, a fake army group, staged in Kent, England, because German analysts were certain the Americans would use their best general for the main assault. They were that convinced of his dominance. General Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to von Rundstedt, wrote after the war, "Patton's campaigns in Sicily and France showed bold and energetic leadership, a reckless driving power. He called him the most dangerous of the Allied generals in the field." General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, a man who had fought alongside Rommel in North Africa, described watching Patton's Third Army erupt from the Normandy breakout in late July 1944. Within 72 hours, Patton had driven his columns 60 miles deep into the German rear. Bayerlein said his division simply ceased to exist as a fighting force, not from a battle, from speed. They were surrounded before they understood they were being flanked. Here's the detail the textbooks always skip. German commanders on the Western Front had standing orders that if Patton's Third Army appeared on their flank, disengage immediately. Don't fight. Run. Because once Patton had your flank, you were already dead. He moved at a tempo that the German command system, which required approvals up the chain before major movements, simply could not match. But the German generals weren't universally worshipful. Some of them thought Patton was brilliant but reckless, a savage attack dog who, if left without a leash, might have shortened the war by a year, or created a catastrophic overextension that collapsed his own army. That tension between genius and madness is exactly what made him terrifying. And it's why Eisenhower kept him on that leash. Nobody talks about this with full honesty in mainstream documentaries. The German generals respected Bernard Montgomery, and they also thought he was fundamentally limited in a way that cost thousands of lives. Respect first. Montgomery beat Rommel at El Alamein in November 1942. Full stop. Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated field commander, acknowledged that Montgomery had outgeneraled him, not with brilliance or daring, with meticulous preparation, overwhelming logistics, and a refusal to attack until he was certain of victory. Rommel wrote in his private papers that Montgomery never risked a second Gazala, a reference to a battle where Rommel had ambushed and destroyed a British force. Montgomery's caution, Rommel admitted, was strategically sound. But then, the mask slips. German commanders who faced Montgomery in Italy and northwest Europe in 1944 to 45 used a different word: predictable. General Hans von Luck, a panzer commander who fought Montgomery's forces from Normandy all the way to Germany, wrote candidly in his memoirs that British attacks under Montgomery followed a recognizable pattern: heavy artillery preparation, infantry assault, pause, consolidate, repeat. We always knew, von Luck wrote, that after a major British attack there would be a pause of 2 to 3 days. His men used those windows to reinforce, reposition, and prepare the next defensive line. The Battle of Caen in 1944 is the knife in the wound. Montgomery promised Eisenhower he would capture Caen on D-Day, June 6th. He didn't capture it until July 9th, a full month later. German commanders later said that if the British had pushed harder in those first 72 hours, the entire German defensive structure in Normandy might have collapsed. Instead, they held. And tens of thousands more men died on both sides. General Siegfried Westphal, who served as Chief of Staff on the Western Front, put it bluntly in his post-war interviews: Montgomery never moved until he was ready. Which was professional, but readiness cost time, and time cost lives. There was one moment of unexpected human decency in all of this. When Rommel was wounded in July 1944 and later forced to commit suicide after the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler, Montgomery, who had studied Rommel, tracked him and outmaneuvered him, kept a portrait of Rommel in his personal caravan, as a mark of respect, soldier to soldier, enemy to enemy. Even war sometimes allows for that. But what happened next is where this story stops being history and becomes something else entirely. The official story says Eisenhower was an administrator, not a battlefield commander, a political general who coordinated allies but left the real fighting to men like Patton and Montgomery. The truth is darker and more interesting. German generals were baffled by Eisenhower, not because he was brilliant in the Patton mold, he wasn't, but because they couldn't categorize him. Their intelligence profiles described him as a coalition manager, a politician in uniform. They underestimated him in exactly the way powerful men always underestimate the most dangerous kind of operator, the one who doesn't look dangerous. General von Rundstedt, the most senior German commander in the West, believed that Eisenhower's broad front strategy, advancing along a wide line rather than a single thrust, was a mistake. He believed a concentrated Allied drive in late 1944 would have ended the war before Christmas. He said so after the war. Many Allied commanders agreed. But here's what Rundstedt didn't say, what almost nobody in the post-war analysis mentioned. Eisenhower held together the most fractious military coalition in history: British, American, Canadian, Free French, Polish, commanders with competing national interests, clashing egos, and completely different doctrines. Patton wanted to charge east and not stop until Berlin. Montgomery wanted the single concentrated thrust in the north. French General de Gaulle wanted Paris liberated in a way that maximized French glory regardless of strategic cost. Eisenhower managed all of this, without the coalition fracturing, without a catastrophic strategic blunder, and he won. Von Blumentritt, in a 1947 interview, made a comment that American military historians largely buried because it complicated the Ike as mere manager narrative. He said, Eisenhower understood what his German counterparts never had, that the management of men and alliances is itself a form of genius. Hitler destroyed his generals. Eisenhower empowered his. There's an unresolved mystery here that still sits in declassified archives, barely examined. In the winter of 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, Germany's last massive offensive in the West, German intelligence reports from the period show that Wehrmacht planners expected Eisenhower to panic, to hesitate, to demand his generals halt and consolidate while German armour punched through to Antwerp. Instead, within 48 hours of the German breakthrough, Eisenhower made a decision that his own generals called insane. He turned toward the penetration. He redirected 250,000 men, including Patton's entire Third Army, and ordered them to attack into the German flanks. Patton reoriented an army of 100,000 men in 72 hours in the dead of winter and attacked northward into the German flank at Bastogne. The German commanders, reviewing this in captivity, were silent for a long moment when American interrogators described the timeline. One of them said, "In the German army, that movement would have taken 2 weeks of planning." May 8, 1945. VE Day. At 2:41 a.m., in a schoolhouse in Reims, France, German General Alfred Jodl signed the unconditional surrender. He looked across the table at Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, General Walter Bedell Smith. The cameras clicked. The flashbulbs popped. Jodl asked to speak. He was permitted. He said, and these are his actual recorded words, "With this signature, the German people and the German armed forces are, for better or worse, delivered into the victor's hands. In this hour, I can only express the hope that the victor will treat them with generosity." Nobody in that room answered. Eisenhower refused to meet with Jodl afterward. He considered it beneath him to shake the hand of the man who had enabled years of war crimes. He sent a message through intermediaries. The surrender was accepted. That was all. Jodl was hanged at Nuremberg on October 16, 1946, at 1:11 a.m. The deeply ironic detail, Jodl had spent the last months of the war assuring Hitler that the Allied coalition would fracture, that the Americans and British would fall out, that Eisenhower would be replaced, that the broad front strategy proved Allied indecisiveness. He was hanged in the country his army had occupied because that coalition never fractured. The man he most underestimated, the political general, the coalition manager, had been the architect of his destruction all along. After the war, the German general's interviews and memoirs became military gospel in the United States. The US Army War College curriculum in the 1950s used German after-action analyses extensively. American officers read Manstein, read Guderian, read the Foreign Military Studies to understand what had gone right and wrong. The German generals became, in a strange way, teachers to the army that defeated them. But something was covered up in this process, quietly, professionally buried. Many of the German generals who participated in the post-war interviews had also participated in war crimes. The Foreign Military Studies program explicitly downplayed this. These men were useful. Their tactical and operational insights were considered too valuable to contaminate with prosecutorial complications. Some historians have called this a Faustian bargain. American military doctrine improved enormously, but war criminals walked free, their records sanitized, in exchange for knowledge about how to fight the next war. The ultimate irony, These same German generals who looked down on Allied commanders as unprofessional, political, and too cautious, needed those same Allied commanders' protection to survive the post-war world. Patton, who they feared most, died in a car accident in December 1945, never knowing the full scope of the terror his name inspired in the German command system. Montgomery lived until 1976, long enough to see his reputation endlessly debated, his caution endlessly criticized. Eisenhower became President of the United States. But there's still one secret almost nobody talks about. Among the thousands of pages of post-war German military studies, there is a document compiled in 1947 by former Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS officers at the request of US Army analysts that assesses not just the Allied generals, but the specific question of who would have won if the war had started differently. Different timing, different alliances, different strategic decisions. The document is in the National Archives. It's been declassified, almost nobody has read it. In it, the German officers reached a conclusion that stunned their American handlers. They wrote that the single greatest Allied strategic asset was not Patton's speed, not Montgomery's preparation, not Eisenhower's coalition management. It was American industrial production. They wrote, and this is a paraphrase of the actual language, that no generalship, however brilliant, could have overcome the material reality that America produced more tanks, more planes, more ammunition, and more everything than Germany could ever replace. They concluded that Germany had lost the war in 1941 when America entered it. Everything after that was, in their words, a performance of a play whose ending was already written. Patton was terrifying. Montgomery was frustrating. Eisenhower was quietly devastating. But the real general that beat them? It had no name. It wore no uniform. It worked in shifts, 24 hours a day, in factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Birmingham, Alabama. And not one of those workers ever got a biography.